Wow, it's a good number. Okay, that number is growing more slowly, so I do think that we can start. Thank you, everyone, all of you who are listening and who are attending, and thank you especially to everybody who's on the screen with me who took the time during what is a very busy week to join this event. I'm Adam Isaacson. I'm the Director for Defense Oversight here at WOLA. I do a lot of our border and migration work. WOLA, for those who don't know us, is a human rights advocacy organization based in Washington for the last 50 years. Hopefully this event will give us a little while to think about something other than the election, just for a moment, to stop refreshing those opinion polls, social media accounts, and sort of salvage what remains of our mental health, although what we're talking about is also very serious. I'm joined here by four terrific guests, and I can't wait to get out of the way and hear from them. America Garcia Grewal is from the Eagle Pass Border Coalition in Eagle Pass, Texas. That's in mid-Texas in the Del Rio sector. She is a consultant, an educator, and a very effective advocate and organizer in that part of the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas. And a strong member of the community. Dylan Corbett from Hope Border Institute is based in El Paso. Hope Border Institute, always have trouble describing it because you do important primary research, a lot of very effective advocacy, but also providing services to migrants and others who need it in the area and up and down the border now in other parts of Texas too. Hope is inspired by Catholic social teaching. And it's just, it's a group whose work I admire a lot, and it's great to see you here. Bob Labal is from Human Rights Watch, a consultant right now with Human Rights Watch. He is a longtime civil and human rights advocate, community organizer. He's based in Austin, the former executive director of Grassroots Leadership, and really well known and oft quoted on immigration and criminal justice issues, especially in Texas. And Andrea Guerrero from Alliance San Diego. She is the co-counsel on a landmark use of force case, the Anastacio Hernandez case, which we will talk about. She will talk about. But before joining Alliance San Diego, Andrea was the field and policy director of ACLU San Diego and Imperial counties in Southern California. Before that, she was an immigration lawyer. Now she runs Alliance San Diego, one of the most effective community organizing efforts that I know along the border. She's an expert in international human rights and humanitarian law, use of force law in law enforcement rather, and has done a lot of litigation and has played a key role in formation and management of the Southern Border Communities Coalition. But we're here to talk about something that is really serious. That I think has very few precedents in the United States in the past 50 years. And I'm just going to give a little context so that our speakers don't have to. But basically, the state government of Texas, under Governor Greg Abbott, a Republican, started a border security crackdown in the spring of 2021. He called it Operation Lone Star. It's a package of things that together has cost Texas taxpayers over $11 billion in the past 3.5 years. It's included building many miles of border wall and fencing, including a string of floating buoys in the Rio Grande and Eagle Pass. I would note here that walls and fences don't stop asylum seekers. People who want to turn themselves in, if they're on U.S. soil, have the legal right to ask for protection. And those fences are never right on the riverbank. They can't be. That's not how rivers work. So it does not stop asylum seekers. Operation Lone Star has sent state police and National Guard personnel who have arrested and jailed tens of thousands of people on state charges of trespassing. Texas has passed a law that would actually make any unauthorized border crossing a violation of state law. So you would need trespassing. SB4 is what it's called. It was passed in December. It's currently held up in court. Abbott, as many of you know, has bused over 120,000 migrants to cities governed by Democratic Party mayors without any coordination with those mayors. He's deployed thousands of state police and National Guard soldiers to the border, building bases for them. He's laid dozens of miles of razor-sharp concertina wire along the riverbank, sometimes even in the river. And then what we're especially here to talk about today, stationing those police and guard personnel on the riverbank to confront and sometimes to repel would-be migrants. Often those migrants are people seeking to turn themselves in, many of them families with children. So the organizations here have been documenting what has been happening, and what they report has so concerned us here at WOLA that we added an analysis in September, and we worked with this panel to put on this webinar. So I guess the best place to start then is simply to ask each of you to describe what you've been seeing, hearing, documenting, denouncing. And I'll start with America in Eagle Pass. Please tell me what you're seeing.
Yes, thank you, Adam. I'm very happy to be here, even though the topic is so distressing. I'm in Eagle Pass, Texas. This is where I grew up and have deep roots here. The buoys were put in place in July of 2023. They're only 1,000 feet long, and because of the way they slow the river, they're actually building an island around themselves. So by themselves, in their current location, they're very easy to see as political theater, political stunt. They are not effective. But what is effective are the hundreds of miles of concertina wire that the state of Texas has erected up and down the Rio Grande. Here in Eagle Pass, they've actually bulldozed the banks. They've fronted containers, shipping containers along the Rio Grande River, and they've established checkpoints so that we can no longer access our river. The city of Eagle Pass owns Shelby Park, and yet since January 10th of 2024, we've not been able to enter it or use it in any way, with one exception, and that is the Border Vigil. The monthly Border Vigil here in Eagle Pass gathers to remember those who've needlessly died on our southern border. That includes the migrants, many migrants, but also includes the law enforcement who've died of suicides. They've died in high-speed chases. We've also had a number of residents of Texas who've died in high-speed chases. We're experiencing high-speed chases in border communities. 70%, nearly 70% of all the high-speed chases occur in a border county, compared with only 30% happening in the rest of the state of Texas. The over-policing here is incredible. We receive moving vehicle violations at a rate 4 times higher than the rest of the state of Texas. So even though this is marketed as an immigration issue, it's actually heavily impacting our border communities and heavily impacting Texas residents. But we also here in Eagle Pass have a military base. The state of Texas is paying $14 million a month to a private group called Team Housing Solutions to house these soldiers. Now, I was in Dimmitt County on Monday, and they have to bury the bodies of any migrants that they find almost immediately. And I asked them, well, why don't you have a container? Why don't you have a refrigerated morgue? And they said, when we asked for it, we got $1. Okay, Eagle Pass got over $1 million in vehicles for just one department this year, and yet the state of Texas only gave $1 to provide for the people who are dying at incredible numbers here in the border. I can pass it to the next person, probably Dylan.
That mute button. Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Dylan in El Paso.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. First, just thanks to Adam and to WOLA for all the work that you guys do on border issues and defense oversight. It's super important. And we definitely feel, as border communities, organizations working out here in Texas and on the border, we definitely feel the solidarity. So keep up the good work, and many thanks for that solidarity and closeness to us as we experience difficulties like this. And thanks to America for her comments now, and to the other panelists, Bob and Andrea. It's good to be with y'all. I think the one of the most salient ways to describe what we've seen with SB4 is the way that it's really impacted physically the ecosystem of our community here. El Paso's on the border, Texas-Mexico border, but we're all the way in the west, so also on the border with New Mexico. And we're a big community. It's a major metropolitan community. A lot of folks think, we're in the Wild West, we're a lot of dust, and we got a lot of dust, but it's a big community. We're almost 750,000 people on this side of the border, and then our sister city just on the other side is quite large, over 1 million folks. So it's a significant community, and we already have a large complex of law enforcement and border enforcement. So Border Patrol, CBP, HSI, ICE, et cetera, in addition to the state enforcement that's already here, and local law enforcement. But what we've seen since the end of December 2022 has really been almost, you could consider it sort of an occupation. The state of Texas has sent an incredible amount of personnel. So National Guard, DPS, which is the Texas State Law Enforcement Agency, to El Paso in really significant numbers. And they've really, I think occupation is the right word, because they've really taken control of our border. El Paso's border is unlike the border in other parts of Texas in that it's pretty much federal land. So you don't have a lot of private property, private land on there. But there's already a very large wall that was the height of which was actually increased under the previous administration, under the Trump administration. And for all about 1.4 miles, it's a very fortified. The town is very fortified. The city is very fortified on the southern border with Juarez. But the state authorities have really taken control of that federal strip of land that's on the U.S.-Mexico border. And we're divided by the river. The river is what divides us from Mexico. And what the Texas authorities have done is, as America talked about, they've installed this really incredible, there's just an incredible amount of concertina wire that has, the intent of which is to prevent migrants from crossing the river into the United States. And in El Paso, we have, of course, we've long been for decades and decades a transit route for many vulnerable migrants, many asylum seekers who would cross that river. So the intent is definitely to engage actively in immigration enforcement, to stop people from approaching the border, including bona fide asylum seekers, including other vulnerable migrants. So there's a physical aspect to it. The DPS, though, the state has also deployed in very high numbers DPS, the Texas State Troopers to El Paso. And here we also see, as America talked about, a significant increase in the amount of high-speed chases that take place in our urban community, right in the urban core, right on the highway that runs through the urban core of our community. Last year alone, there were 328 pursuits by DPS. So that's almost one a day. And they're often at 100 plus miles an hour. The doctors that we work with, we have a clinic for migrants, and the doctors that we work with tell us that in the county hospital, it's now the #1 cause of mass casualty incidents in the hospital. So it's significant. It's causing a lot of damage. It's causing a lot of property damage, in addition to the loss of lives and the physical injuries. I think last year we had 7 people die. And this year, there's also been a number of people who have died, in addition to, again, very serious injuries that people have sustained. So they're at the border, they're in the city. It's important to note, too, that they're subject to less rigorous engagement policies when they do engage in those use of force. Our local police, for example, are under very strict. They're monitored by the police department during a high-speed chase. Border Patrol, for example, when they do engage in chases, they are monitored. There are other policies which govern that. DPS has fewer. DPS agents have the discretion to engage in these chases, and they're not supervised in real time as other law enforcement agencies are. So it's been significantly much more dangerous. And then the third thing I think to note is the increase, the spike in deaths in terms of people crossing the border crossers, migrants. Because we're right at the border with New Mexico, the amount of people trying to sort of go around this complex of concertina wire, they're being pushed into the desert. And we just ended out the government's fiscal year, and it was, I think, overall along the whole U.S.-Mexico border, the deaths may have subsided a little bit when you look at the national numbers across the border. But here in El Paso, we had about 180 people die over the last year, which is higher than last year. And last year was the highest number on record. So it's also contributing. It's probably the #1 contributor right now to deaths here in our community. So yeah, I think those are the 3 things that I would set the table with in terms of the impact on our community here in West Texas, in El Paso.
Thank you, Dylan. Yeah, I just looked up the numbers, and the El Paso sector of Border Patrol, which also includes New Mexico, 39 deaths in 2021, which went up to 71 in 2022, 149 last year, and as you just said, 180. I mean, that is a vertiginous increase in people being found dead on the U.S. side of the border. Bob, from Austin, you actually go to the border often and are seeing what this looks like also.
Yeah, thanks, Adam, for pulling this together. And America and Dylan, and Andrea, great to be in the space with you. Much of this knowledge comes from, riding in cars with America along the border. So many props to what she and the Border Coalition are doing in Eagle Pass. Just to add a few things from Human Rights Watch's perspective. Adam, you mentioned that the state of Texas has spent $11 billion on this program. I also want to note that Governor Abbott has asked for nearly $3 billion more for the next biennium. So Texas will be entering a legislative session starting in January, where much of these issues will be debated. I also want to note, right, that despite sort of all of the theater around this program, that there is not evidence that this program has reduced migration any more than in any other parts of the border, right? And that you don't have to take my word for that. Separate analyses by the Wall Street Journal in 2023 and the Houston Chronicle earlier this year demonstrated that. But what we have seen, and I think that we're hearing about this in this call, is that migration is being pushed into more illicit, more dangerous, more deadly channels that is actually more profitable for the cartels, who report being able to raise their prices in order to navigate people around the concertina wire, the buoys, these state-constructed walls. So we're seeing, a spike in deaths up and down the border. And we're also seeing law enforcement. And to note that, yes, we have the Texas National Guard and Texas DPS. There's also been more than a dozen other states that have sent National Guard to the Texas border to participate in Operation Lone Star, and scores of non-border law enforcement that have been sent from other Texas counties and as far away as Florida, right, Iowa, other states that have sent like state highway patrol or game wardens from the state of Florida, which are all over Eagle Pass and have been for years. And a few of the things that we've documented at the border in the last year include the Texas National Guard repeatedly firing pepper spray projectiles at arriving migrants, including migrants, asylum-seeking migrants, women with children. In several incidents, the Texas National Guard members fired these projectiles, which are sort of little, they are fired from a launching gun, right? That looks very much like a gun that would fire a traditional bullet, but they're a ball containing pepper irritants on arriving migrants who are not engaged in threatening acts. So I want to note that this is a serious escalation, right? The use of force against arriving migrants. As both America and Dylan have mentioned, right, we have seen a spike in high-speed vehicle pursuits all over Operation Lone Star counties. In the summer of last November, we documented that there have been at least 74 people killed and 189 people injured as a result of 49 pursuits by Texas troopers or local law enforcement or both in the first 29 months of Operation Lone Star. And the vast majority of those cases are simply start with a traffic violation, right? So we are chasing people oftentimes at upward speeds of 100 miles an hour. And this really goes against policing best practices and trends with policing across the country, where law enforcement agencies are moving away from high-speed vehicle pursuits precisely because they are so deadly. And then third, I just want to mention, we see the sort of overt acts of pushing migrants back, right, along the border, and asylum seekers along the border. And then I think we also see the way in which National Guard and DPS presence along the border is contributing to a really harrowing situations by precluding a CBP from intervening in situations that are really dire. I witnessed one of those in the summer of 2023 from an area very near Shelby Park, where I watched a family try to cross, right, seeking asylum. They got caught in sort of in the middle of the river with a toddler about the same age as my own kid, who for a minute it looked like that toddler was going to be swept away. National Guard simply looked on from the border. There were law enforcement boats in the water stationed upriver in no position to help that family, and at no time provided any aid to that family. I also saw migrants in clear medical distress, right, vomiting in the river, with National Guard refusing to provide water, right, or any kind of medical aid. So I think that this is something that we're seeing on a daily basis, right? And that is with a Human Rights Watch observer standing there talking to National Guard as this is happening. So I think that we can, safely say that this or worse are happening when we are not present. So, I think it's a very dire situation, and I'm really glad that WOLA and all the organizations here are sort of lifting up what is happening at the border.
Thanks to the three, but before I turn to Andrea, I have a few more clarifying questions about just what this looks like. Do I have it right that if I want to turn myself in as an asylum seeker, if I get past the state forces and somehow manage to get to the federal Border Patrol usually forces, I actually can turn myself in for asylum, but you have to run this gauntlet of state forces to get there? Second, if there's rows of concertina wire between the state forces and the migrants, how can there be any claim of self-defense or avoiding bodily harm or anything like that? And third, just if you're a human rights observer, how do you see this? How do you see what's happening? Do you have to be standing on the Mexican side of the border in order to get anywhere near what's happening? Any of you who have an answer to those?
Speaking for Eagle Pass, there is very, very little that can be seen from Eagle Pass. If you are on the bridge itself, you can look down and see some things, but the bridge is not set up for you to observe from the bridge. And so, for example, Witness at the Border, they set up directly across from Shelby Park. And when we've had visitors, we will usually go to a spot on the Paseo del Rio, the linear park that runs along Shelby Park. We'll take observers there, or we'll take them into other parts of Piedras Negras, our sister city, that overlook the river, and we'll let them see from there. But it's very, very hard to see any of this from a publicly accessible part of Eagle Pass.
Yeah, and I would just add, when I witnessed the family, Shelby Park had not yet been closed, or I think it had been closed and reopened. This is in the summer of 2023. And I'll just say, if you go to Eagle Pass and Piedras Negras, like you could not have a more stark contrast on either side of the border, right? Where on the Piedras side, there's a beautiful park, right? Families picnicking, swimming in the river, fishing. And then on the US side, it is rows of concertina wire and armed soldiers with long guns standing above that concertina wire.
I can speak a little bit about El Paso. Here, it's a little bit more difficult to witness what's happening because the actions take place between the river and the wall, and that's really the area that both DPS and the National Guard is occupying. But you can witness it from the Juarez side. So if you're on the other side, it is possible to see. A couple things of note. We have a roving clinic that we deploy on the Juarez side, and there have been times when migrants have approached the river, have approached the area near the concertina wire, and a couple of different experiences. One, no, I mean, trying to request asylum at the concertina wire, it's not going to happen. We've witnessed personnel from the National Guard push people back physically after they've tried to pass through the concertina wire. Everybody's seen the dramatic pictures of mothers and children going through the concertina wire, and that happens, and they end up in our public hospitals. And So there's people do sustain injuries because of those things. And oftentimes people have no choice. The area in Juarez is actually quite controlled. So while you're going north towards the United States, you have to, as you said, run through a gamut of the concertina wire and then the National Guard before you might be able to encounter a Border Patrol agent where you might be able to turn yourself in. The area south of the river is also patrolled by a number of different Mexican agencies. So there's often the presence of Mexican immigration officials there, local law enforcement, and the National Guard, and Mexico's National Guard, all agencies which are all patrolling migrants as well, and will often evacuate people from those areas and try to deter migrants from trying to seek protection at the U.S.-Mexico border, which is problematic. But also criminal organizations. So we've had to attend to people who are literally caught between the National Guard and criminal organizations in Mexico. They cannot leave that area. And we've treated people, that population, people who have sustained injuries by having been hit by the canisters from tear gas from the National Guard, people who have been physically pushed back or who have sustained injuries on the concertina wire or who have been injured by rubber bullets. We've treated people who've experienced all of that. And it is something that's visible from the Juarez side. But another area where it's visible from is New Mexico. Texas, the concertina wire is sprawling and mushrooming. And now we've begun to fortify our border with New Mexico. So the National Guard is actually extending that concertina wire, I guess, to deter the threat that's posed to us by our neighboring New Mexicans. So it's certainly visible from there.
This is incredible. I mean, Andrea, I mean, you've done so much work on this in California, and also I know in Arizona too, where the topography is different. It's not a river. You often have double layers of fencing. How does this compare to what you've been seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Oh, and really appreciate hearing from the co-panelists. What's going on in Texas is an egregious example of what's going on across law enforcement in the United States with regard to high levels of racial profiling, warrantless searches, and excessive force, especially in southern border communities and counties. And as America has pointed out, this kind of enforcement is affecting not only migrants and would-be asylum seekers, but also Black and Brown members of the southern border communities. You know, taken as a whole, it undermines the dignity of our communities. And I think it's important to put this in the larger context of what's going on in the United States. The fact that this is allowed to happen has everything to do with a deadly and deficient use of force standard that is unique to the United States and violates international human rights treaties that we've signed and ratified. We can get into that a little bit more when you're ready. But just for context, every year, over 1 million people in the United States are threatened with or subjected to use of force by U.S. law enforcement, including police and border agents and prison and jail officials. And more than 250,000 people are injured from that force. Over 1,000 are killed. And we should note that 2023 was the deadliest year in a decade for use of force. So until and unless we change the use of force standards, we're going to continue to see law enforcement agencies engaged in the kind of abuse and to be able to get away with it with impunity because we have such a deadly and deficient standard.
Thank you, Andrea. And yeah, I think let's talk about use of force standards and what we know about what they are in Texas. Just by way of a preface, I mean, there was CBP, Center, Customs and Border Protection, the federal agency, during the Biden administration made some revisions to their use of force policy. It requires officers to have, and I'm quoting, a reasonable belief, I'll try that again, a reasonable belief that the subject of such force poses an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the law enforcement officer or to another person before force, especially lethal force, is used. Now, I may have this wrong. Please correct me. Do we even know what the standard is? Is there a published use of force standard for Texas DPS and for Texas National Guard on this mission?
I
If
don't,
I-
I don't. Oh, go
Anybody in
ahead.
Texas?
Yeah,
go.
yeah. If I could jump in here, because I think we need to pull out a little bit our lens. There is no federal law that establishes a use of force standard, period. Some states have use of force statutes, some don't. No, no state and no part of federal government is using a standard that complies with our international treaties. So whether they have one or not, everybody in the United States is operating under a Supreme Court interpretation of the Fourth Amendment prohibition against unreasonable search and seizure. And the Supreme Court has said that law enforcement can use a level of force that is, quote, objectively reasonable. And the court has evaluated that from the perspective of the officer engaged, right? And, you know, and has explicitly said that what is reasonable varies and cannot be explicitly defined. That is a unique perspective in the world. Most of the rest of the world uses a use of force standard that requires law enforcement to act only when it is necessary and proportionate, to use force that is only necessary and proportionate. That is far different from an objectively reasonable standard that is entirely based on the perspective of the officer, right? And so what does that mean? What does necessary mean? It means that that force is used as a last resort to achieve a legitimate law enforcement objective. It requires a law enforcement agency to exhaust viable non-violent measures before resorting to force. And when force is used, to limit it to the minimum amount required to accomplish the specific and legitimate objective. Okay, so what would not be necessary? Not necessary, because not legitimate, would be to respond to insults or verbal confrontation. Force in that instant would not be necessary, but we hear all the time, you know, the agent hit me when he thought I said something about him, right? It's not necessary to punish or retaliate against a person. Again, we hear about these incidents all the time. It's not necessary to prevent future resistance or attempts to flee. I think this particularly comes into play with the vehicle pursuits and or shooting at vehicles or using interventions that create dangerous situations, right? And it's not necessary to resolve a situation more quickly. So that's what necessary means, right? What does proportionality mean? That means that the degree of force used must correspond to the level of resistance exhibited by an individual, or the gravity of the threat, or the law enforcement objective, right? So we all know what disproportionate looks like. You know, it looks like when somebody throws a punch and you pull out a gun, and that punch is thrown from 10 feet away. Or more classically, what we hear all the time is, you know, somebody was throwing a rock, and so we shot, you know, the person in the back 10 times. So, you know, the necessary and proportionate is the standard that we need to call everybody to. It should be noted that in the US Constitution, Article 6, treaties that we sign and ratify are the law of the land, but we're not treating them that way in the United States. We have signed and ratified treaties that dictate that we should limit force to that which is necessary and proportional, but that is not what we're doing. So we can talk about whether, you know, DPS in Texas or National Guard, you know, what levels of force or what how they're interpreting Supreme Court standards, or what do they have written down in their internal policies. But none of it across the United States, none of it is sufficient. All of it is deadly and deficient. And in Texas, it's a little bit more egregious than everywhere else, because quite frankly, there are no guardrails on that use of force.
Before I go to Texas, Andrea, is the objective reasonability standard a reason why there is just about 0 cases of CBP or Border Patrol personnel ever being having been held accountable for use of force?
Yeah, that's right. In the 100-year history of Border Patrol, no agent has ever been held accountable for, yeah, that's right, 0 for the America's giving people a visual representation of that. 0 agents have been held accountable for killing what we believe are thousands of people over that time span. We've only been counting since 2010, since the death of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, and here in San Diego, and since his violent killing, more than 300 people have died in law enforcement in encounters with border agents, none of which have been successfully prosecuted. Most of the time, charges are never brought, and it's because this standard of objectively reasonable is so low. So what that meant in the case of Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, and I'll just mention that one in particular because it's a landmark case that's about to be decided that could change the course of events. In that case in 2010, he was beaten and electrocuted with a taser while he was hogtied and lying face down, surrounded by U.S. border agents until he stopped breathing. All of that was deemed reasonable, and no charges were brought against any agents, right? And it's not just what's happening at the border or what's happening to brown people, right? We can connect what's happening here in these instances to what's happening to Black men and women throughout the United States under police use of force, right? So take the case of Michael Brown, an unarmed teenager who was shot while he was walking in the streets of Ferguson. That was deemed reasonable, and no charges were brought. Both the family of Anastasio and the family of Michael Brown have challenged the United States for its deadly and deficient use of force standard in cases that will soon be decided by the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. In fact, the Anastasio case, we hear it has been decided. We're just waiting for it to be released. So that decision could come anytime. That will be the first ever decision. It is the first ever case in an international human rights tribunal challenging the system, challenging the use of force standard in the United States. And, we're hopeful for a positive ruling, but if we get one, that could change the course of what happens in the United States.
I look forward to seeing what the commission does come up with. So if that's the federal level, what are we seeing in Texas? And I don't know which one of you has the most knowledge of this. So Bob.
Yeah, I can tell you what the state agencies are telling us, right? In response to the vehicle pursuits, in response to the use of pepper projectiles. When we looked at the law enforcement pursuit policies of different law enforcement agencies when it came to the vehicle pursuits report, DPS's vehicle pursuit policy, in comparison to CBP, which has issued guidance on vehicle pursuits, gives individual officers essentially total discretion and ultimate authority to engage in a chase without providing clear guidelines other than the general caveat against endangering life or property contained in the transportation code. So essentially no guidance even around this. And then when it comes to using pepper projectiles, we have asked through open records request for the guidelines. We received nothing from the Texas Military Department, which is the agency that sort of contains the Texas National Guard. When asked in a border security committee in June of this year about the use of pepper projectile, Texas Military Department General Thomas Seltzer told the committee that for the Texas Military Department, force may be used for self-defense or the defense of others, but must be the minimum level prescribed by the situation and proportional to the situation. Now, we can certainly say there is video evidence of National Guard using pepper projectiles to fire at or near people who are objectively showing no threat, right? Physical threat to law enforcement, aren't even near law enforcement, right? Or another person.
I'll just say a couple things. I think what Andrea said regarding the objective reasonableness standard is really important, that it's flawed and deficient and riddled with loopholes. But just to put things in context, all the organizations reflected here on this webinar and many throughout the country and here along the border have fought for decades for progress, transparency, accountability in the standards of engagement and use of force with organizations like the Border Patrol. And it was only last year, 2023, that CBP adopted that reasonable standard, objective reasonableness standards for high-speed vehicle pursuits, just last year. So as flawed as it is, it was the result of lots of work by organizations over many years, and that extends to other issues that have been problematic with law enforcement over the years. For example, just the respect for basic human rights, respect for non-refoulement, respect for asylum rights, et cetera, of those at the border. What's happening with DPS and the National Guard is, even though that progress is not where we want it to be, all of it's being eroded right now because Texas has taken possession of the border. And the border is only about 2,000 miles long, and Texas has got maybe 1,100 miles. It's just over 50%. So whatever Texas does is majorly consequential for what's happening on the border regarding immigration enforcement. Texas is effectively has taken over immigration enforcement for more than 50% of the border, which means that all of despite the limitations, and it's not perfect, and we have so much more to do, what we have fought for as advocates over the decades to get more transparency, accountability, and greater human rights standards with immigration enforcement, it's all being eroded because of what's happening. And you're having 20-year-olds armed with automatic weapons, who are not in the National Guard, now administering our immigration laws. So it's very troubling from that perspective. And as Bob said, the high-speed pursuits, DPS, they don't have the same standards that we do in our local community with our sheriff, with our local police, and with Border Patrol and CBP. They don't rise to the same level. Our local community, our local politicians, we met with DPS on a local level, our local elected leaders, and as a community organization, we've met with leadership, and they refuse to review their pursuit policies despite the risks to public safety. So this is really problematic.
I'm about to drop a link into the Q&A, and this is from December of 2023. It's content warning. It's very graphic. This was actually filmed while we were installing our cross memorial not too far down from where I was, and the photographer showed us the footage, but when I showed that to the National Guard, the Texas Military Department, their communications officers like, oh, look, he fell. And you can see very clearly the people being pushed down with shields, and there's visible blood. Like I said, there's a content warning on there. I've also got 2 other videos in there, but with my own eyes, I have seen the National Guard soldiers shout at people and encourage them to go back into the water. I saw this in February at night. I was on the Mexican side, and there was fire department. There were all kinds of rescuers trying to encourage the asylum seeker to come back to the Mexican side and seek safety. And the soldiers on the American side shouted at her. She went into the water and was lost from our sight. I have no idea whatever happened to her, but that was traumatic, but not as traumatic as September 7th of this year, when I personally witnessed National Guard soldiers firing pepper balls at an unarmed man. Not only unarmed, he was almost naked. He was hardly wearing any clothing at all. And he approached, and you could hear kind of a murmured voice coming across the water to the Mexican side. And in response, you could see the body language and the shouting from the soldiers coming back. And it's just, it's horrible. It's really horrible to see. I've also personally witnessed refusals of women with children in distress. You know, the head is lolling, it's not, you know, coming forward, and them denying water. In that particular case, we were on the bridge above where this incident was happening, and myself and some students from Colorado and their faculty members, we basically got on the phone and stopped on the bridge until the Department of Public Safety came out there, and they allowed her to come onto land. We later heard from the news that she was sent back to Mexico, but DPS shouted at us saying, you know, are you the ones that filed the complaint? We're like, yes, we did. Because if this is how they're acting when we're watching, when a crowd of students are watching with their cameras out within earshot, what's happening in the areas that we're not watching?
America, you've got people are like the woman with the baby. Are they knee deep in water on the U.S. bank of the river?
So in this particular case, the child was actually on land. The mother's feet were barely covered by water. One child was in her arms, and then behind her was another woman with the child that was non-responsive in their arms. And there was a child by the second woman in the water, probably about knee deep in water. But the first child, maybe about 6 years old, was fully on land. And actually, I can pull that off of our Facebook page and drop that link into the Q&A. But I was like, you know, we've got a child in distress. We have people who are physically in the United States. All we have to do is be past the halfway line, the international boundary. But they were physically had feet on dry land, and they were asking for help. And National Guard is just pointing away, go away, go away. And so we had a couple of people who had walked past the center point of the bridge. And so while we were watching, I ran up to tell the faculty members what was going on. And then Customs and Border Patrol would not let me return to the Mexican side of the bridge where all of our students were watching. So I wasn't able to stay to the very end, but the students, the remaining faculty did. And the woman was allowed to come to land, and they gave water to the child. So they didn't die, which is a victory some days, but at the same time, you know, people don't willingly put themselves in danger unless that is the only option they have. And I've seen people arrive at the concertina wire with heavy coats and rugs and everything else. They know what they're getting into. This is not something where they suddenly travel for 3 months and then, surprise, it's concertina wire. They know what they're getting into, and they still keep going, which makes me go, what on earth is so bad behind them? And why are we treating people like this when most of us have family members who fled war, fled from persecution, fled from similar situations? And, you know, we would not want our family members to have been treated like this. Also, we're living in areas with increased desertification. We're seeing so many people who are displaced by hurricanes and everything else. Are we going to suddenly say, I'm sorry, you can't leave North Carolina, Tennessee is full. You know, you can't leave Florida, you know, Alabama, Georgia are full. So we really need to be treating other people the way we want to be treated, because pretty soon that's going to be us trying to go to Canada. That's going to be us trying to go places that are not experiencing these same things.
No, the Section 208 of the Immigration Nationality Act does say that if you are physically present in the United States, you have the right to ask for protection. You don't have the right to be pushed back. Let's put a pin in that, because I see a hand up from a colleague of all of ours, who we all know, Chris Rickard in Brownsville, Texas, a longtime human rights lawyer. We should, I'm going to allow Chris the microphone for a minute, just to see, because we have not heard from that part of Texas. Go ahead, Chris, if you're around.
Is it going over to me? My apologies. This is Felicia with the Sidewalk School.
Oh, hi. Okay, Felicia Rangel Panaro is also just across the. You spend most of your time, I think, in Reynosa and Matamoros. But yeah, you're certainly welcome. Your name shows on the Zoom as Chris, but you're
Okay.
just great,
Are
great to
you
hear from
sure?
Felicia. Sure, if you have
Okay.
something to say that's right on this topic, please.
Okay, my apologies. Okay, so yes, I am Felicia Rangel Sampanaro. I am with the Sidewalk School. We do work in Matamoros and Reynosa. We've worked the Matamoros encampments since they started back in 2019 on up. And let me tell you that the wires, the Constantina wires, the fencing, the wires on top of the fencing, once looking out from the Matamoros encampment into Brownsville, Texas, they've broken off the bottom of the bank so the wire can dip down to the water and go all the way up.
Wow, into the
So
water.
if it's a discussion, if Operation Lone Star is successful, the answer is no. What the families do is just put more clothing around them, put clothing around the baby, and they push up through the wire. And then they get all the way up to the fencing where they have the fence and then more wire on top as they're speaking to National Guard or Border Patrol, whoever is standing at that moment on the other side of the fence, as they refuse to open the fence or cut it open to let people, you're on US soil, but they still refuse to open the fence to let people come on up. And what's supposed to happen when you touch US soil? We have seen it time and time again. We've seen it. We had a woman give birth and we had to call a doctor via Zoom.
Bank.
Yeah, because they wouldn't cut the fencing. So she was stuck there having contractions. This is actually New Year's Eve, and we had to call the doctor. She was so kind to pick up the phone to help out this woman, her husband, and her family because she's about to give birth on U.S. soil, but the guards wouldn't cut open the fence. But we have seen many abuses done here in our region alone. Victor and I do travel the border. And let me say, whoever spoke about San Diego, my heart goes out to you. We saw people falling from the wall when we went up there to visit El Ultralado. I mean, that's something we had never seen before. That hurts to see people fall and not get medical treatment. But in our region, that's what Operation Lone Star looks like. It's not a deterrent at all. It really hurts and it kills people. But people keep going because you have, I hate saying the word cartel. You used to call them the group, but you have the group right
Organized
behind.
crime. Yeah.
Right. But thank you.
No, thank you, Felicia. It's great to hear from you. And that's really as troubling as what we're hearing elsewhere in Texas. So that does bring us back to the state of Texas is, as was said, enforcing federal immigration law, it appears, and that includes asylum law. Now, there's a fancy sounding term called refoulement, which is a major international human rights violation when you actually turn someone away who is asking for protection. And it is illegal in the United States, but it appears that Texas forces are, whether they're using force or not, are committing this illegal act all the time. Is that correct? And if so, I mean, are there other examples? I'm thinking of, or like de facto examples of federal forces, either by commission or omission, allowing this to happen or colluding with this? And that question is open for anybody who knows anything about what you've been seeing.
Yeah, I can offer a few comments. I think it's undeniable. I've witnessed cases. I've witnessed a pushback, a physical pushback. I've witnessed one that resulted in family separation. A mom who was unable to get through the concertina wire, but dad and child did, and they were apprehended, and mom was physically pushed back and verbally assaulted by National Guard personnel. I witnessed it with my own eyes, and we treated her through our clinic. So I think it's undeniable. The question about what's the role of federal authorities here, I think it's, on any given day, if you were to go to Ciudad Juarez, just south of us, and drive along the border, and to be able to kind of witness the physical terrain and the presence of the different law enforcement agencies, border enforcement agencies, On one day, you might travel several kilometers, several miles, and you will see several vehicles of the National Guard and of the DPS, and you might not see any Border Patrol. And so if you're a migrant and you're able to, as you talked about sort of running the gauntlet, and you were able to penetrate that gauntlet in order to try to access a Border Patrol agent in order to make a protection claim, you might not find that agent. And that's why I use that word occupation, because they've taken effective control of our border and they are administering that law. And I think it's a really important question. Where is Border Patrol in all of this? And we need to really scrutinize the level of cooperation, effective cooperation, implicit, explicit, to understand what their role is. I think at a minimum, the Department of Justice, DHS, we need observers from both of those institutions, because I think there are also several significant civil rights implications here. And that's why the Department of Justice also needs to get involved, because there are civil liberties questions, violations, no doubt. In addition, including with the arrests that are being made by DPS agents of migrants who are crossing the border, both here in El Paso and other parts of the border. We need observers to understand what that impact is. And we need the federal government to be much more aggressive. Now, they are taking some action. When we mentioned the buoys, the federal government has sued over the buoys. My understanding is that they've also taken some action regarding the events around in Eagle Pass. But they haven't taken aggressive action against Texas. There's not an aggressive posture. They need to make sure that they need to guarantee that Reform is not happening on our border. That's their responsibility, and we do need to press them to step up on this.
Absolutely. Any other?
Yeah, I just wanted to add another way that we see this happen is, I mean, we often see migrants come literally shout asylum on US soil, right? I mean, on the riverbank on the American side, and be told by National Guard or DPS agents, usually National Guard, no, go back or go downriver, right? Go to the port of entry, which is not a place that you can access, right? Or go downriver. And by downriver, they mean go to the opening, which is private property, where they are then arrested for trespass. And because of the disaster declaration, it is an enhanced trespass charge where migrants are then funneled into a separate and unequal system of jailing, where if I were arrested for trespass here in Texas, I would be out of jail the next day. These folks are now facing a year in jail because of this enhanced trespass charge. So not only are we pushing people back physically, but we're also, in many cases, we have seen the deceptively luring people into the criminal legal system, essentially, where they are then jailed in separate sort of unequal jails in South Texas.
So just to clarify, not only are we telling people go back into the river, which itself is an enormous safety issue, but go back into the river and get out in some place where we haven't told you you're going to be arrested and likely jailed.
Those are the facts in many, many cases of public defenders who are defending folks. Yes.
I will say that in talking to people who are not immigration advocates, many people are unaware that immigrants bear the cost of all of their legal fees in applying for immigration. And it is a surprise to them to learn that once criminal charges are filed, they're entitled to a free defender. And so in addition to all the money that goes into Operation Lone Star, over $11 billion to date, we're also paying for public defenders. And I've seen people get more unhappy about that single fact than about the number of people who die, the number of residents who are killed in high-speed chases, every single thing else. So money talks. And I want to make sure that we always have public defenders for everybody, regardless of their national origin or their immigration status. But I am happy that that has been a talking point that has helped people look at how horrible the situation is.
Public defenders are what anger people. Anything from the California perspective that you'd like to add on refoulement and the right to asylum?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to look to the federal government to enforce the right to non-refoulement when the federal government itself, the Biden administration, has issued executive orders and taken policy actions to block access to asylum for people approaching the border, right? So we're just in a dark moment in this country in history where we are walking away from principles of human rights and human dignity. And it's going to be up to us, the people of conscience, to bring us back to the human rights principles that are fundamental to all of us, to live in dignity, right? Dignity is the point of a democracy. We didn't form a democracy just to be creative about three branches of government. We formed this democracy, as stated in the Declaration of Independence, to protect people's inalienable, as in born with, shouldn't be taken away, can't be taken away, their inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is my hope that regardless of the election outcome on Tuesday, that we as a people can find our way back to those human rights principles that lift up human dignity.
Well, thank you. I mean, one last set of issues before we conclude, and really coming off of what Andrea just said about how sort of the nature of our state may be changing. One thing that's really struck me about the deployment at the border and on the borderline in Texas is that so many of the personnel are military. The National Guard is, they're at the command of the governor. And they are citizens who usually spend one weekend a month and maybe 2 weeks a year training, and they're there for natural disasters or public order issues. But this has been a long-term deployment. It has had these rules of engagement that you rarely see soldiers playing on U.S. soil, using, firing weapons on U.S. soil at civilians is really, really, really rare on U.S. soil. And WOLA is a human rights organization that, comes from a foreign policy perspective. We started by accompanying people in countries that were under military dictatorships in the 70s and 80s. Those countries made transitions to democracy, and a big part of those transitions was getting the military back in the barracks and out of situations where they were in regular contact with civilians and even confronting civilians. You got civilian defense ministers, and you made civilian police forces. So this sort of stuff wouldn't happen as much anymore. Of course, we're seeing countries like Mexico putting the military back on the streets, and it worries us, but we're seeing it in Texas as well. I don't know if any of you have anything. I mean, just keep in mind, these people have the same basic training as U.S. military. Their patches say U.S. Army right on their uniforms. So this is, for me, a scary precedent, especially when you do see candidates in our elections talking about maybe using the military against protesters and in other contexts. That's just me making more of a comment. If you'd like to talk about that, please do. Oh, go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So for anyone who doesn't know, we have law in the books called the Posse Comitatus Act that prevents the U.S. military from engaging on U.S. soil. And so the way National Guards are deployed is in a non-combat condition. So they are supposed to be engaged in like administrative support. And so that's how they're supposed to be limiting what they do. But of course, that doesn't happen. We have, as far back as the 1980s, we had a National Guardsman who was deployed in Texas, allegedly to support Border Patrol, who did not kill, but shot Ezekiel Hernandez. And, and then fast forward to now, when nobody's watching the watchers, what is happening. I think depending on the election outcome, we have lots to be concerned about, because there are ways in which the U.S. military could be used through the invocation of the Alien Enemy Act. And I think we have to be concerned about that. And we can, perhaps you could, hold another Zoom webinar if we get to that point, But the other thing to keep in mind is that even without the US military, the largest law enforcement agency in the country is Customs and Border Protection. They operate with less guardrails than any other law enforcement agency, even less than DPS, because statutorily they are allowed to engage in searches without warrants. There are no prohibitions on racial profiling. In fact, there's a green light go from the Department of Justice for racial profiling in the border region. And of course, their use of force policy, while there have been some gains in their use of force policy, it is still deadly and deficient. And if there is a pathway to fascism and authoritarianism, which is a dark place to go, it is paved with the stones of CBP's authority that already exists. It's the only difference between the reality that we're living in Texas and California and Arizona and New Mexico and the rest of the country, when we're thinking about potential protesters, etc. The only difference is resources. There are more CBP agents in San Diego than there are San Diego police officers. And that is more so true throughout the other parts of the border region, right? So we have lots to be concerned about. And quite frankly, there are gaps in our democracy, gaps in the integrity of our civil liberties and civil rights that we need to shore up when we can, as soon as we can.
I'll just say something that Andrea mentioned, that the administration itself, this administration has also put in place some asylum rules, which have contributed to the deterioration, the eroding of asylum protections. And in a sense, they've ironically been benefiting from what Texas has been doing at the border politically. There's a benefit perhaps that accrues to them politically by not taking action. But there's a cost to that, which is the slow erosion of our commitment to asylum at the border. And that is also predicated on the effective militarization of our border communities. And that is something that should scare us all. Because in addition to the National Guard, I should also say, we also have in El Paso, we have Pentagon troops here as well. Not as many, not as pronounced, but we also have the presence of the U.S. Army here. And so that slow erosion of asylum law has come also at the cost of militarization. And we have a candidate, one of the major candidates who's running for office, who's talked about a mass deportation proposal, and when asked how he would do that, has talked about the use of the National Guard. So taking the model at the border that we have and extending it nationwide, and that should trouble us all. And so again, until we have leadership from Congress and the administration to put in place an effective system of humane border management, we're going to keep continuing to kick this can down the road, but it comes at a real cost, erosion of protections for the vulnerable, but also we begin to blur the lines around core issues of civil liberties and things that we thought we could take for granted, like posse comitatus.
I'm going to agree with that. And also there was a question there about how these are trial balloons for what could happen under a Trump administration. We're a learning lab, just full stop. So it's political theater, but we saw Governor Abbott come down to Eagle Pass and wheel around delightedly in front of news crews and camera crews and everyone. He had 3 press conferences in Eagle Pass in less than 2 weeks. And we started to see the same DPS officers accompanying the governor, the same people. And then in April of 2024, we saw those DPS officers on TV when they were breaking up the anti-genocide protests on the UT Austin campus. So what we allowed to happen to us here in Eagle Pass then got used against our students, against our future in Austin, Texas. We're seeing the language that's being used here in Texas exported to states all around. I think there's 7 states. Bob, you may have this number before I do. But also, I had someone tell me that they'd seen some of our language in South Africa. So we've got to stop this, because otherwise, when the U.S. gets a cold, the rest of the world, when the U.S. sneezes, the rest of the world gets a cold. What we're seeing here is spreading, and it's spreading fast, and it's deadly.
The question about whether, what is happening in Texas is sort of a trial balloon for a future administration. That came from Vicky Gass, the director of the Latin America Working Group. Thank you, Vicky. But it does lead into the bigger question, and sort of our parting question is, what can be done about this? What can we do about this? And obviously we're a week away from knowing what sort of environment we'll be working in. I would say maybe we should just assume, unless you do have a good recipe for, dealing with the Trump and Stephen Miller formula of doing things, just assuming that we're working in an institutional setting, sort of like we have now. What levers exist at the state level, at the federal level, but also what levers, or what more needs to be done at the level of narrative and public opinion, at the level of organizing, at the level of philanthropy, in order to really, you've just painted, a terrifying picture about what's happening right now, but perhaps an even more terrifying picture about where this could lead. So that general picture, some perspective on what we can be doing next and what we should be doing that we're not doing enough of. Why don't we go in reverse order? Go ahead, Andrea.
Yes. So, I think for those of us who have been at this for a while, we know where the accountability gaps are. We know what needs to change in our federal laws. And if we get a chance to do that, we should and we can. And at the state level, depending on what happens, we may have less or more opportunities depending on what state you're in, right? But I think there are also opportunities. So, for example, in California, we've worked hard to pass state law that restricts any public official from engaging or assisting federal law enforcement in any kind of immigration proceedings or enforcement, right? We have set up in San Diego County a county level legal defense fund for immigrants in deportation proceedings. These things might be possible in more progressive states and might not be possible in a place like Texas right now. But I think, what we can do always is bear witness as America is doing to what's going on, so that we can make change. And I think, I've been at this a while now, and so I guess I have the humility to understand that sometimes we are the agents of change. Sometimes we are creating the conditions for change. Both are valid, and we can't just give up and stop. We have to do both. And I guess lastly, I'll just say there's a lot more that we could be doing to invoke human rights mechanisms, tools, resources, narratives, mandates, etc. We've started to do that. The Anastasio case is one example of that. 2025, the United States will be subject to what is called a Universal Periodic Review before the United Nations. And that is a really good opportunity to coordinate ourselves and bring forward our concerns about treaty violations. People say, why does the US care? They care because they want other people to do what they ask through these treaty negotiations. And lastly, I'll just say, in the international arena, this is more humanitarian law and less human rights law, but there are some same principles that are just simply not being applied here. So the idea of necessity and proportionality, you hear that language all the time when we're talking about international conflicts, and yet we don't embed that in our domestic law enforcement restrictions and policies, right? So lots that we can do, and convene us again, Adam. I'll come back.
I will definitely convene you again, especially regardless of the outcome of the elections. We need to keep talking about this. And also just big props to you and your colleagues who've been really using the levers of the inter-American human rights system on this more than we've seen done before. You really pioneered that. So turning to Texas, where talking about the legal environment, and I mean, you've got an attorney general who's actually committing lawfare against shelters and service providers and lawyers. I mean, this is a much darker environment that you're in. But given that, yeah, what are some of the possible ways forward? Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that continuing pressure on the federal administration to intervene, as Dylan said, right, through the sending of civil rights monitors who absolutely should have been at the border years ago, but there's still a dire need for it. You know, we wrote a letter to the Department of Justice about this summer. And clear guidance on the collaboration and the role of federal law enforcement agencies vis-a-vis this program, right? So I don't think we got to it, but there was a bill passed during the last legislative session that would allow federal agencies to enforce Texas law, which I don't think that any federal agencies have signed up to do so, but there is certainly talks to do that, and the Border Patrol Union has been supportive of that bill. And then I think at a state level, you know, even given the way that Texas's leadership has clearly used this issue, I do think that there is a role for legislators of good conscience to play an oversight mechanism. And I think that that means simply asking hard questions, which just doesn't happen a lot of times at the Texas legislature. But, you know, we've been trying to get information about how many times have Texas National Guard agents, soldiers shot at migrants, right? Just very basic information, right? How many injuries have been recorded on the concertina wire, right? You know, these kind of like very basic information that, as Andrea said, right, I think like allows us to set the stage, right, for organizing advocacy and policy change that might not happen tomorrow, but needs to happen in the long run, and that information needs to be collected.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Dylan, any other, I'm sure there are many other things to talk about here.
No, I think my colleagues have summed it up well. And have talked about the need for the federal government to take more robust action against Operation Lone Star. But there is a role for state. It's complicated, of course, and difficult in Texas, given the politics, but there is a role for state legislators to take action. We do need more transparency and accountability regarding data collection, the reporting requirements around Operation Lone Star, so that we can understand exactly what's happening. We do need oversight, and so we do need our Texas legislators to stand up to make that happen. But ultimately, Operation Lone Star, it's a political project. It's a racist political project, and as you mentioned now, it's taking place within a broader context, a broader assault on people of color, migrants, border communities, SB4 actions against, you know, by, as you mentioned, by the Attorney General against service providers at the border, including religious organizations. It's a real struggle. And we're going to need organizations like WOLA and those on this call to continue to work together, to push back, to promote a more positive narrative over the contributions of migrants to our state and to our country. We need to vote, of course, in the national elections. It's super important. We need to let our voice be heard. And you asked what philanthropic organizations can do. It's important. This is a long-term battle in Texas, and we do need to work at a local level, and we need to engage in cross-border organizing to create welcoming communities which prioritize human rights. And so we also need the philanthropic community to stand up and invest in local organizations that are trying to make that happen at the local level in Texas, so that we can make the gains and achieve the change that we need.
It really does feel like I'm talking to human rights defenders in a Latin American country at times, because of the way the deck is stacked and the severity of what you're denouncing. America, any final recommendations here too?
Yes, we need alternatives to the state dollar. And I haven't been doing this for very long. I came back to Eagle Pass after 30 years away and looked around and said, this isn't on, no. And I understand that's the definition of an activist, someone who says you can't have my rights, I'm still using them. So, but from the community, We need alternatives to that state money. We're a poor community, and without the state dollars, we'd be in big trouble. In 2023, our bridges were closed for 37 days. Now, bridge tolls make up 60% of the City of Eagle Pass's annual revenue, and the Mexican shoppers are 30% of our retail sales. And so when this happens, we're in trouble. And it's hard to resist. It's hard to say no when the only game in town is law enforcement. And so, Laredo doesn't look like Eagle Pass. They have alternate income streams. So I don't blame anybody here in the community for supporting Operation Lone Star because that's the only choice they have. But we've got to give people more choices. Otherwise, we see what desperation looks like. We're seeing the bodies wash up in Eagle Pass. One justice of the peace said that she signed 26 death certificates in a single day. And so we've got to find a way that our border communities are not desperate. Otherwise, they'll enable this behavior to continue into the future.
That is absolutely right. So I'm going to conclude. I hate to do it, but you've been so generous with your time today. You might have seen me typing. That was me on our work Slack telling my colleagues, oh my goodness, what an amazing, actually I didn't say goodness, but what an amazing panel. That was a great discussion, and we will do this again. A huge thanks to you. You can see what's alarming, what's unfortunately not as unique as maybe we thought about what's happening at the borderline in Texas. A huge thanks while we're all on to Ana Lucia Verduzco, our program assistant on the program, who helped make this a a flawless effort, but has also been a huge help and co-author on some of Wolo's own research and what's been happening. And I can barely convey my gratitude to all of you, the dozens and dozens who joined us today, or if you're watching this later, one of the hundreds and hundreds who will have watched this within the next several weeks. And I'm going to go there. If you're a donor, or if you're thinking about being a donor, whether you're going online to give $20, whether you're a big national foundation, please keep in mind the Eagle Pass Border Coalition, Hope Border Institute, Alliance San Diego, Human Rights Watch, and the Washington Office on Latin America. We all do a lot with very little, and there is so much to do. So thank you, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.